He thought she was just another poor woman who had wandered into the wrong place. But by this time tomorrow, he would wish he had never opened his mouth. The glass doors of the luxury dealership slid open with a quiet hiss as Emily Carter stepped inside, her worn sneakers making soft contact against the polished marble floors that gleamed under the afternoon sun. The showroom stretched wide before her, filled with machines that looked more like sculptures than cars, sleek curves of steel, flawless paint reflecting the overhead lights like mirrors. A low hum of conversation floated through the air, punctuated by the occasional laugh from well-dressed customers holding espresso cups and discussing upgrades that cost more than most people's yearly salaries. Emily paused just inside the entrance, her simple jeans and plain white shirt standing in quiet contrast to the tailored suits and designer dresses around her. But her eyes were steady, calm, as if she had every right to be there. And in truth, she did. She moved forward slowly, her gaze settling on a midnight blue coupe displayed on a raised platform, its surface shimmering like deep water under light. For a brief second, something flickered in her expression, not hesitation, but memory, purpose, something far deeper than curiosity. Across the showroom, Blake Thompson adjusted his cufflinks and noticed her immediately. Years in sales had trained his eyes to categorize people within seconds, and Emily, to him, was not a buyer. Not even close. He didn't rush over. Instead, he watched, a faint smirk forming as he leaned slightly toward a colleague, whispering something that earned a quiet chuckle in return. Emily, unaware or perhaps simply unaffected, stepped closer to the vehicle, her reflection faintly visible along its flawless side panel. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the surface, not quite touching, as if respecting something more than just a price tag. It was a small gesture, but one that didn't match the story Blake had already written about her in his mind. Finally, with a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes, Blake approached, his shoes clicking sharply against the floor. Each step deliberate, each movement calculated. "Ma'am," he said, his tone polite on the surface but edged with something colder beneath. "Can I help you find something more within reach?" The words hung in the air longer than they should have, subtle enough to pass as customer service, sharp enough to draw a few glances from nearby clients. Emily turned to face him, her expression composed, almost gentle, as if she had heard versions of that sentence her entire life. For a moment, she didn't answer. The space between them filled with a quiet tension, one built not from volume, but from assumption. Somewhere behind them, a soft laugh slipped out, quickly stifled. Blake tilted his head slightly, waiting, confident in his read, certain of how this interaction would end. But Emily simply met his gaze, her eyes steady, unshaken, and in that silence, something shifted, so subtle it was almost invisible, like the first crack forming beneath a perfectly polished surface, unnoticed by everyone, except time. Blake's smile sharpened just slightly when she did not immediately respond, as if her silence confirmed everything he had already decided about her, and he gestured loosely toward a row of less expensive vehicles near the far wall, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention without seeming obvious. "We do have some pre-owned options that might be a better fit, if you are just browsing." A few nearby customers turned their heads, curiosity flickering in their eyes, the subtle shift in energy spreading across the showroom like a ripple in still water. Emily followed his gesture for a brief moment, then returned her gaze to him, calm and unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "I am interested in that one," she said, nodding toward the midnight blue coupe behind her. Blake's expression did not change, but something in his posture stiffened, a faint disbelief tightening his jaw as he let out a short, controlled breath. "That model starts at $300,000, he replied, each word measured, deliberate, as though he were explaining something to a child who did not understand. "Numbers. Most of our clients schedule a private viewing in advance." The emphasis lingered on the word clients, hanging in the air like a quiet line drawn between her and everyone else in the room. Emily did not flinch. Instead, she took a small step closer to the car, her eyes tracing the curve of its frame again, her reflection moving along its surface like a shadow that refused to disappear. "Is it available?" she asked simply. Blake let out a faint chuckle under his breath, not loud enough to be openly rude, but clear enough for those nearby to hear, and one of his colleagues turned slightly, watching now with open interest. Availability is not the issue, Blake said, his tone cooling further. Fit is. The word landed heavier this time, no longer disguised, and a quiet murmur passed through the small crowd that had begun to form, drawn by the tension they could not quite name, but could clearly feel. Emily's hands remained at her sides, relaxed, her shoulders straight, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her eyes now, something deeper than patience, something that suggested she had heard far worse and endured far more. For a moment, she said nothing, and the silence stretched, thick and deliberate, until even Blake seemed slightly unsettled by it. Then, without raising her voice, she asked, "So you are refusing to show it to me?" The question was simple, but it stripped away every layer of politeness he had been hiding behind. Blake straightened, his smile returning, thinner now, sharper. "I am suggesting," he said, glancing briefly at the onlookers before returning his attention to her, "that this is not the right environment for you." The words were unmistakable this time, and a few customers exchanged uncomfortable looks, though no one spoke. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to react, to argue, to defend herself. But Emily did none of those things. Instead, she held his gaze for one long, quiet second, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming something only she understood. Without another word, she turned and began walking toward the exit, her steps steady, unhurried, her reflection trailing behind her across the marble floor until the glass doors opened once more and she disappeared into the afternoon light. Behind her, the showroom slowly exhaled, conversations resuming in hushed tones, but Blake remained where he stood, watching the door for a moment longer than necessary, a faint crease forming between his brows, as if something about the encounter had not gone according to the script he thought he knew so well. The glass doors closed behind Emily with a soft final click, sealing off the murmurs, the judgment, and the polished illusion of exclusivity that lingered inside. But outside, the air felt different, lighter, as if the world itself refused to agree with what had just happened. She walked down the sidewalk without rushing, her steps measured, her expression unchanged, though beneath that calm surface, something had quietly settled into place. Not anger, not humiliation, but clarity. Across the street, traffic moved in steady lines, engines humming, sunlight reflecting off windshields in sharp flashes, and Emily paused briefly at the curb, pulling her phone from her pocket with a motion so natural it drew no attention from anyone passing by. For a moment, she simply looked at the screen, her reflection faintly visible in the dark glass, and then she tapped once, bringing the phone to her ear. The call connected almost instantly. "It is done," she said softly, her voice even, controlled, as if she were confirming something long expected. There was a pause on the other end, a voice too quiet to be heard, but whatever was said made her lips curve ever so slightly, not into a smile, but into something closer to certainty. "Tomorrow," she added, and then ended the call without another word. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and crossed the street, disappearing into the flow of everyday life as if she had never stepped into that showroom at all. Back inside, Blake had already turned his attention to a well-dressed couple near the center display, his posture shifting seamlessly back into polished professionalism, his earlier tone replaced with warmth and enthusiasm that felt almost rehearsed. "This model comes with a custom interior package," he was saying, gesturing toward the car with practiced ease, his voice confident, smooth, as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. The couple nodded, engaged, impressed, exactly the kind of interaction he preferred, the kind that validated his instincts, his judgments, his sense of control. And yet, every so often, his gaze drifted, just briefly, toward the entrance, as if expecting it to open again, as if something unfinished lingered in the air. He dismissed the thought quickly, straightening his jacket, refocusing on the sale, telling himself that people like her came and went all the time, that there was nothing unusual about it, nothing worth remembering. But the faint crease between his brows remained, a subtle sign that his certainty had not fully returned. Hours passed. The showroom lights grew warmer as evening approached, and one by one, customers left, their conversations fading into the quiet hum of closing routines. Papers were filed, desks were cleared, and the polished floor reflected fewer and fewer footsteps until the space felt almost hollow in its silence. Blake gathered his things, exchanging a few casual remarks with his colleagues, laughter returning easily now, the earlier tension dissolving into the comfort of routine. By the time he stepped outside, the sky had shifted to deep shades of orange and purple, the city winding down around him, headlights beginning to replace sunlight. He glanced once at the empty street, then turned toward his car, unlocking it with a quick press of a button, the familiar beep echoing in the quiet evening air. As he drove away, the dealership behind him stood still, its glass walls reflecting the fading light, holding within them the memory of a moment that seemed insignificant at the time, but had already begun to change everything. Because somewhere in that city, plans had been set into motion, quietly, deliberately, without noise or spectacle. And by the time morning arrived, the same doors that had closed on Emily Carter would open again, but this time, nothing inside would feel the same. Morning arrived with a quiet certainty, the kind that did not announce itself but could be felt in the stillness before something shifted, and as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the glass facade of the dealership, the showroom slowly came back to life. Lights flickered on one by one, casting a warm glow over the polished marble floors, and the familiar scent of fresh coffee drifted through the air as employees settled into their routines, straightening displays, adjusting ties, rehearsing the same practice smiles they wore every day. Blake arrived a few minutes before opening, his steps confident, his expression composed, as though the previous day had been nothing more than a routine interaction already forgotten. He exchanged brief greetings with his colleagues, his voice light, casual, slipping easily back into the rhythm of control that defined his world. The doors opened, and customers began to trickle in, some browsing, some serious, all fitting neatly into the categories he understood so well. For a while, everything moved exactly as expected. Then, just before noon, a sound cut through the steady hum of conversation, low at first, almost indistinguishable from the distant traffic outside, but growing clearer with each passing second, a deep, refined engine note that did not belong to ordinary cars. Conversation slowed. A few heads turned toward the front windows, curiosity pulling their attention away from polished sales pitches and rehearsed charm. Blake paused mid-sentence, his words hanging unfinished as he followed their gaze. Outside, gliding smoothly into view, was a Rolls-Royce, its presence commanding without effort, its dark exterior reflecting the world around it like a moving mirror. It did not rush. It did not need to. The vehicle came to a precise, controlled stop directly in front of the entrance, its engine settling into silence that somehow felt louder than the sound itself. For a brief moment, no one moved. The showroom, so often filled with confident voices and easy laughter, fell into a strange, suspended quiet. Then the driver's side door opened, slow and deliberate, and a man stepped out, his tailored suit catching the light in subtle lines, his posture straight, composed, carrying a presence that did not need to be announced. He closed the door gently, almost respectfully, and without hesitation, he walked toward the entrance, each step measured, each movement unhurried, as if he already knew exactly where he belonged. The glass doors slid open before him, and as he entered, the shift in the room was immediate, undeniable. Conversation stopped entirely now. Even those who did not recognize him felt it, the quiet authority that seemed to follow him like a shadow. Blake straightened instinctively, his earlier confidence flickering for just a fraction of a second as something unfamiliar crept into his awareness. The man's gaze moved across the showroom, not hurried, not searching, but deliberate, as though confirming something already known. And then, without raising his voice, without changing his expression, he asked a single question that landed with the weight of everything that had been set in motion the day before. Who asked my wife to leave? The words were calm, controlled, but they did not echo. They did not need to. Because in that moment, the room did not just go quiet. It held its breath. The question did not echo, but it settled over the room like a weight no one could ignore. And for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, no one answered. not because they did not hear, but because they suddenly understood that whatever response came next would matter more than anything said before. Blake felt it first, not in the words themselves, but in the way every eye in the showroom shifted, slowly, almost reluctantly, until they landed on him. The confidence he had carried just moments ago did not disappear, but it faltered, just slightly, like a step taken on uncertain ground. He cleared his throat, forcing a polite smile back into place as he stepped forward, each movement careful, measured, as though trying to regain control of a situation that had quietly slipped beyond him. "Sir, I am sure there has been some kind of misunderstanding," Blake began, his tone smooth but lacking the ease it once held. The man did not respond immediately. He simply looked at him, his expression calm, unreadable, his eyes steady in a way that made it impossible to hide behind rehearsed words. The silence that followed was not empty. It pressed. Blake continued, more quickly now. "We strive to provide the highest level of service to all our clients. And if someone felt otherwise, I would be more than happy to clarify. You asked her to leave," the man said quietly, not raising his voice, not interrupting, simply stating what was already known. Blake's words stopped mid-sentence. Around them, the room had gone completely still. Even the soft hum of the air system seemed to fade into the background. For the first time, uncertainty showed clearly in Blake's eyes, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but unmistakable. He hesitated, searching for the right phrasing, the right angle, something that would restore the balance he had always relied on. "I made a professional judgment based on the situation," he said finally, his voice tighter now, more defensive than before. The man took a single step closer, not aggressive, not rushed, but deliberate enough to close the distance between them in a way that made the shift undeniable. "A judgment," he repeated, his tone unchanged, as if examining the word itself. Then, after a brief pause that seemed to stretch across the entire room, he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small, simple envelope. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance. No gold seal, no visible mark of importance, just a clean white surface that contrasted sharply with the tension surrounding it. He extended it toward Blake. "Open it," he said. Blake hesitated, just for a second, then took the envelope, his fingers no longer as steady as before. The faint sound of paper sliding against paper seemed louder than it should have been as he pulled out the contents. His eyes moved quickly at first, scanning, expecting something routine, something manageable. Then they slowed. The color drained from his face in a way he could not control. The document in his hands was not a complaint. It was not a refund request. It was a confirmation. Ownership transfer authorization. The dealership. His dealership. The room did not react immediately, because most people did not yet understand what Blake had just read. But they could see it in him. The shift. The realization settling in, piece by piece, as the certainty he had built his world on quietly unraveled. The man did not raise his voice. He did not step closer. He simply watched, allowing the silence to do what words no longer needed to do. And in that silence, the truth became impossible to avoid. Blake's fingers tightened around the paper as though gripping it harder might somehow change what was written on it. But the words did not shift, they did not soften, they remained exactly as they were, clear, official, undeniable. And for the first time since he had stepped onto that showroom floor that morning, he had nothing to say. The confident explanations, the polished phrases, the easy dismissals he had relied on for years all seemed to disappear at once, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier with each passing second. Around him, the others began to sense it more clearly now, not the details, but the magnitude of whatever had just unfolded, and one by one, conversations faded completely until the entire room stood in quiet attention, watching a moment that none of them fully understood, yet all of them could feel. The man in the tailored suit did not rush him, did not demand an answer. He simply waited, his posture unchanged, his presence steady in a way that made the silence stretch even further. Finally, Blake lowered the document slightly, his eyes lifting, no longer certain, no longer in control, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different weight now, stripped of its earlier confidence. "I did not realize," he began, the words slower, careful, as though choosing each one mattered now in a way it had not before. The man tilted his head slightly, not dismissive, not aggressive, but unmistakably firm. "That is the point," he said quietly. The words were simple, but they landed deeper than anything else that had been said. Blake swallowed, the shift in his expression now impossible to hide, and behind him, one of the other employees took a small step back, as if instinctively creating distance from a situation that was no longer safe to stand inside. The man continued, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying a clarity that cut through the room without effort. "You made a decision about someone you did not understand," he said, his gaze never leaving Blake's. "You decided who belonged here and who did not." The words did not accuse loudly, but they exposed everything that had happened the day before with a precision that left no room for denial. Blake's shoulders straightened slightly, not in confidence, but in reflex, as though trying to recover something that was already gone. "I was following standard practice," he said, though the sentence lacked the certainty it once would have carried. The man did not argue. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he reached forward and gently took the document back, folding it once with a calm, deliberate motion before placing it back into the envelope. The simplicity of the gesture made it clear that the paper itself was not the point. "Standard practice reveals more than you think," he replied, his tone even, almost reflective. A faint murmur moved through the room, not loud enough to break the silence, but enough to signal that everyone present now understood that something irreversible had taken place. Blake opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, to explain, to recover, but no words came, because there was nothing left to justify. The man glanced briefly around the showroom, taking in the polished cars, the silent employees, the watching customers, and then returned his attention to Blake, his expression unchanged. "My wife walked in here yesterday with respect," he said. "She left with none from you." The sentence settled into the air like a final line that needed no repetition. And in that moment, the balance of the room shifted completely, not through force, not through volume, but through something far more decisive. The truth had been revealed, and there was no way to step back from it. Blake stood there with his hands at his sides now, no longer holding the document, no longer holding on to anything that resembled control, and the weight of the room pressing in on him was no longer subtle. It was undeniable, visible in every pair of eyes that refused to look away. The man's words had not been loud, but they had settled deeper than any raised voice ever could, and for the first time, Blake seemed to understand that this moment was not about a single interaction. It was about something much larger, something that could not be smoothed over with a quick apology or a practiced smile. He inhaled slowly, as if steadying himself, then spoke again, his voice quieter now, stripped of the edge it once carried. "I can correct this," he said, the sentence coming out more as a hope than a statement. "If your wife returns, I will personally make sure she receives the service she deserves." The offer lingered in the air, fragile, insufficient, and immediately it was clear to everyone listening that it was not enough. The man did not react right away. He simply regarded Blake with the same calm expression, as though measuring the gap between what had been done and what was being offered in return. Then, after a brief pause, he shook his head almost imperceptibly. "This was never about a transaction," he replied, his tone even, unchanging. The words landed with quiet finality, cutting through the last attempt at recovery. Blake's shoulders lowered slightly, the realization settling in deeper now, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, unavoidable understanding that nothing he said in this moment could undo what had already been revealed. Behind him, one of the senior staff members shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the office corridor as if expecting someone higher up to intervene, but no one stepped forward. No one spoke. The silence had become something else entirely now, not just absence of sound, but presence of consequence. The man took a small step back, creating just enough distance to signal that the conversation, at least in its current form, was over. He reached into his jacket once more, not for documents this time, but simply adjusting the fabric with a calm, practiced motion that reflected a life lived without needing to prove anything. "You decided who belonged here," he said, his voice softer now, but no less clear. "Today, you learned that you were wrong." There was no anger in his tone, no satisfaction, just a statement delivered with certainty. Blake nodded once. Almost automatically, though the gesture carried none of his former confidence, only acknowledgement. Around them, the showroom remained still, every polished surface reflecting a moment that had shifted something invisible but permanent. A customer near the back lowered their phone, realizing they had been holding it up without even noticing, while another employee straightened slightly, as if trying to reset themselves within a space that no longer felt the same. The man turned slightly toward the entrance, his attention already moving forward, leaving the moment behind without needing to prolong it. But just before he stepped away, he paused, glancing back one final time, not at Blake, but at the room as a whole, as if addressing something beyond a single person. "Respect is not proven by what you sell," he said quietly. "It is revealed by who you choose to see." The words did not echo, yet they seemed to remain in the air long after they were spoken. And as he walked toward the exit, the showroom did not return to normal. It could not, because something had been exposed in that space, something that could not be unseen, and Blake, standing at the center of it all, finally understood that this was not the kind of mistake that faded with time. It was the kind that stayed, long after the room fell silent. The glass doors closed behind him with the same quiet precision as before, but this time the silence that followed did not belong to him alone. It lingered inside the showroom, settling into every corner, every polished surface, every reflection that now seemed to carry a different weight. No one moved at first. It was as if the entire room had forgotten how to return to what it had been just moments earlier. Blake remained where he stood, his posture no longer sharp, no longer commanding, but still, almost fixed in place, as though stepping away would somehow confirm what had just happened. Around him, the employees exchanged brief glances, subtle, uncertain, unsure of where to look or what to say, their usual confidence replaced by something quieter, more cautious. One of the junior sales associates shifted his stance, straightening his tie with a nervous motion, while another pretended to adjust a display that did not need adjusting, their actions small but revealing. The customers, too, had changed. The ease that once filled their expressions had faded, replaced by a quiet awareness that what they had witnessed was not just an interaction, but a moment that exposed something deeper, something uncomfortable. Blake finally exhaled, a slow breath he had not realized he was holding, and glanced down at the spot where the envelope had been in his hands just minutes ago, as if expecting it to still be there. It was not, and neither was the certainty he had built his decisions on. He looked toward the entrance, the same doors he had watched countless people walk through, the same doors he had used to measure worth within seconds, and for the first time, they did not feel like a threshold he controlled. They felt like something else entirely. In the far corner of the showroom, a quiet voice spoke, barely above a whisper, but clear enough to be heard. Was that the new owner? The question moved through the room, not loudly, but with a kind of inevitability that could not be stopped. No one answered immediately, but the silence that followed carried its own confirmation. Blake closed his eyes for just a brief second, the realization settling deeper now, not as shock, but as understanding. When he opened them again, the room had not changed, but he had. The polished floors still reflected light, the cars still gleamed under the ceiling fixtures, the world around him remained exactly as it had always been, and yet nothing felt the same. A senior manager stepped out from the office hallway, his expression composed but tighter than usual, his gaze moving from Blake to the rest of the staff before settling in place. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Everyone back to your stations," he said calmly, though the tone carried a quiet authority that left no room for hesitation. Slowly, almost reluctantly, movement returned to the showroom. Conversations resumed, but softer now, more measured, as if everyone was aware that something invisible had shifted and could not be undone. Blake nodded once, more to himself than to anyone else, and adjusted his jacket, the motion automatic, familiar, but no longer confident. He took a step forward, then another, returning to the center of the showroom, the place where he had once stood with certainty, with control, with the belief that he understood exactly how the world worked. Now, that belief felt different, thinner, as though something essential had been removed. And as the day continued, as customers came and went, as deals were discussed and smiles were exchanged, one thing remained, quiet but unshakable. The memory of a single moment, when everything he thought he knew had been proven wrong, not with noise, not with force, but with truth delivered in silence. The rest of the day passed with a quiet tension that no one openly acknowledged, yet everyone felt, as though the showroom itself had absorbed the moment and refused to let it fade. Customers continued to arrive, stepping onto the same polished floors, admiring the same vehicles, engaging in the same conversations, but something beneath it all had shifted, subtle yet undeniable. Blake moved through his responsibilities with practiced precision, greeting clients, explaining features, offering options, but his voice no longer carried the same effortless certainty. There was a pause now, a fraction of a second before each interaction, as if he were measuring something unseen, reconsidering judgments he once made without thought. Late in the afternoon, as the sunlight softened and stretched across the glass walls, the doors opened again, and this time, Emily Carter stepped inside. There was no announcement, no dramatic entrance, just the same quiet presence she had carried the day before, her simple clothing unchanged, her expression calm. But the room noticed. Conversation slowed again, not out of curiosity this time, but recognition. Blake saw her immediately. For a moment, he did not move, the distance between them feeling larger than the few steps that separated them. Then, slowly, he walked forward, his posture straighter, but not rigid, his expression composed, but no longer guarded. When he reached her, he stopped at a respectful distance, his voice steady, clear, and without pretense. "Welcome," he said. The word was simple, but it carried a weight it had not carried before. Emily met his gaze, her eyes just as steady as they had been the day before, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer tense, but deliberate. "I would like to see the coupe," she said, her tone unchanged, as if picking up a conversation that had never truly ended. Blake nodded once, immediately, without hesitation. "Of course," he replied, and this time, there was no condition, no qualification, no judgment hidden beneath the words. As he led her toward the vehicle, the path through the showroom felt different, not because the space had changed, but because the way it was being walked